The year 1777, a big turning point year for the Revolutionary War. I'm going to bring you back quickly to 1776, how that ended with the surprise attack on Christmas night in 1776, where the Hessians, supporting the British, were forced to surrender, as the nighttime attack definitely caught them off guard in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, this view confirmed what the British thought. The New Englanders were the biggest troublemakers. If we can crush them, the rest of the rebellion will give in. So therefore, most of the battles in 1777 were around closing off New England. So they centered in Hudson River Valley, the Great Lakes, Canada. So if we can close this off and basically squash them out, the rest will give in. This approach started off strong for the Redcoats. In the summer of 1777, the Redcoats took Fort Ticonderoga in New York. General Burgoyne and his troops there, with some of the Hessian mercenaries, those paid soldiers, dragged their guns and ammo. They took it to the highest point of Fort Ticonderoga, the summit. The Americans saw these guns, cannons aimed at them. They retreated. So at this point, Fort Ticonderoga was in the hands of the British. Now, this news led to an ecstatic King George. "I have beaten all the Americans," he stated. George Washington, feeling down, obviously, after the defeat. Ben Franklin, who was over in France, was trying to get support from the French to help us. He was kind of discouraged because the French saw this and didn't really want to support a loser. So, however, this taking of the fort by the British, the Redcoats traveled slowly through this wilderness in New York. So you got General Burgoyne, he's traveling through the wilderness, New York. There were some battles in a town of Bennington, Vermont, where the Redcoats actually did have a victory. There was a battle won by General Howe, now going towards the south. He had his troops, his British troops, fighting towards Maryland, Philadelphia. Now, this is all setting the stage for the Battle of Saratoga up north in New York. You have a Burgoyne traveling with his British troops through that New York wilderness, and it's setting the stage for a very critical battle at Saratoga. October 1777. Battles and surrender at Saratoga. Now, like we said before, we have Burgoyne, who was a British general. He is traveling through the wilderness in New York, while General Howe, towards the south, is fighting remember, there were battles happening at multiple fronts. This is up in upstate New York. The Americans braced themselves for a fight near the town of Saratoga. They built fortifications in a strong position on Bemis Heights. From the heights, their guns pointed down on river and road. The British couldn't pass by. They would be forced to fight or retreat. Fortifications, protective walls. They built them there so that they would come upon them. You're either going to have to run away or stand and fight. When his army neared Bemis Heights, Burgoyne chose to fight. His advance guard approached the fortifications and entered a clearing in the forest called Freeman's Farm. All was silent, except for the gobbling turkeys in the trees bordering the clearing. Suddenly, the Redcoats heard the crack of rifle fire. They were under attack. Daniel Morgan's riflemen were perched in the trees and crouched behind fences, signaling to each other with turkey calls. Continental forces and more British troops came to the clearing. Soon a raging battle swayed back and forth. The Americans pushed the British back into the forest, only to have them charge forth again. As soon as the British thought they had finally overcome the rebels, the Americans found new strength. As night fell, Hessian reinforcements helped the British regain the field. The Americans were ahead at this point, but the Hessians, who were supporting the British, those paid soldiers, they came to kind of help the British regain that area. After this close battle, Burgoyne had his men dig trenches nearby and waited for help from General Howe. It never arrived. Howe was already settled down for the winter in a fine Philadelphia home, while Burgoyne worried and waited. The supplies dwindled, and the sick and the wounded cried out for treatment. Things were not good at the Burgoyne camp. He's waiting for Howe, General Howe, who had just had a bunch of victories down near Maryland and Philadelphia, to send support. it never arrives. General Howe does not send more help. For more than 2 weeks, the armies were within shouting distance of each other, but the only fighting was within the American camp. Its commander, Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold were feuding. So the British camp and the American camp were right near each other, but nothing was happening for a while, for a few weeks. But there was a lot of bickering and fighting within the American camp. Benedict Arnold was a bold and fearless fighter. Washington believed him to be the most active, spirited, and sensible officer in his army. But somehow things never seemed to go right for him. Though he'd fought brilliantly in many battles, Arnold wasn't rewarded with the recognition and the rank he felt he deserved. Now, after the fight at Bemis Heights, Gates didn't give him credit in a report to Congress about the battle. Gates and Arnold argued about the report. Arnold became so angry that Gates relieved him of his command and ordered him to remain in the tent. That was a critical moment, and you'll see this in the Ed puzzle. Benedict Arnold basically wants credit. He feels like he was very helpful in that attack on Bemis Heights against the British, where they turned away. But the report that went to Congress didn't give him as much credit as he would have liked. With his army getting weaker by the day, Burgoyne realized he must either fight now or surrender. To force a way through, he sent a detachment, a special force, crashing against one end of the American line. The British were driven back in a stormy battle. When Benedict Arnold heard the crack and roar of the muskets and the cannons, he leapt to his feet and ran out of his tent. "Come on, boys," he shouted as he raced to the battlefield. His horse was shot beneath him, then he was shot in the leg, but he continued to lead his men to fight. This is after he was told to not fight. He was relieved of his duties, but yet he still had to support his men. So that day ended there with heavy losses for the British. Burgoyne ordered his army to withdraw under the cover of night. In a heavy rain, they retreated to Saratoga, where the Americans surrounded their camp and kept up a steady barrage of fire. As Burgoyne gathered his officers to discuss their next move, a cannonball crashed onto the table where they sat. A brief flicker of hope came to him when he heard that British forces under General Clinton were near, but soon even that faded. Dressed in his finest uniform, Burgoyne surrendered his troops and his army to Horatio Gates as the British and Hessian troops stacked their arms. An American band played Yankee Doodle. When news of the victory traveled across the country, patriot spirits and hopes rose again. The surrender inspired poems and songs, and a dance called Burgoyne's Surrender became a popular request at balls. In France, Ben Franklin was finally granted an audience with King Louis XVI. General Gates ordered an officer to carry the glorious news to the Continental Congress. The officer stopped along the way. He couldn't resist a side trip to see his steady girl. By the time he delivered his message, the news was 12 days old. Samuel Adams made a motion to grant the officer a pair of spurs, and all rejoiced. So this turned out to be a huge moment for the Continental Army, the Americans. France decides to support us. The spirits are lifted. They're feeling confident, and this is going to carry them going forward. Hopefully the Ed puzzle will help you guys learn a little bit more about this. Little added shot here. The surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga, where he's surrendering to the American army.